Coming up on this week's show, how to make your own NES at home.
How to use your Game Boy to steal cars.
We're joined by legendary games journo, Jazz Rignall.
Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 233, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to this week's show as we get ready to reminisce about classic video games, fill you in on what's been happening in the world of retro gaming and tech over the last 7 days, and the bit you really come for, bringing you a very special guest. That's why people listen to this podcast, isn't it? Not to hear us three banging on. It's to listen to these legendary guests that we bring you every week on the show. Actually, you know, I say that. We did like a survey about a year ago, do you remember? And it was like, we wanted to know why people listen to the Retro Hour podcast. So we put it out on our socials. It was like, you know, do you listen for the news and like us three, or do you listen for the guests? And I think it was exactly 50-50.
Yeah, it was pretty much 50-50. Some people like, oh, I just listen to the news and turn off the guests. Some people like, oh, I listen to the guests straight away. It was really good. And also we did one which was, who would you like on the Retro Hour?
Yeah.
And the amount of people that said they wanted this week's guest, who is Julian Jazz Rignall. And my God, this guy has done so much for video games and video game culture. So he started off as a high score gamer. So he was really good at gaming himself, became a video game journalist, started working with EMAP, and launched Meme Machine magazine, which was absolutely amazing. I remember him on Games Master showing off that mullet, and he was on
the most famous mullet in gaming, wasn't he, back in the day?
He was on the BBC as well, and then he went to IGN and led their kind of online expansion, which is absolutely amazing because they're one of the biggest gaming networks in the world. They probably are the biggest gaming network. And also, he was a software director of Virgin, so he was doing games like The Lion King, Jungle Book, but also that legendary, really weird, unreleased, ultra-violent game Thrill Kill.
So, I mean, he's got a really interesting history. And, you know, it's been a while since we did a show about gaming magazines. But, I mean, in the past, we've done an episode with Tony Takushi about meme machines. And Gary Penn, who also worked on Zap 64. Steve Jarrett, who, of course, was on Zap. And then he did official PlayStation magazine. We did Ben Vost and Tony Horgan, you know, CEO Amiga and Amiga Format. And I always enjoy the episodes that we do about magazines because it's kind of hard to imagine now just what an impact they had in the pre-internet world. I mean, really, that was the only place, especially before TV shows like Games Master came along, where you could find out gaming news. The magazines were so important back then.
And there's not been that much transition from magazines to online. And I think that's where Julian's kind of shined. He's managed to kind of take that video game culture and put it out there online. You know, we still have Games Master magazine around, which is absolutely amazing. And
I think it just closed last year, actually,
but
it did last a long time.
And that did outlive the show massively, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, you know, we're talking about that golden age of gaming journalism, you know, the golden age of computer and gaming mags. And Julian Jazz Rignall, he was a rock star in the world of games journalism. So really excited to get him on. And like Ravi said, one of our most in-demand guests. He's going to be coming up on the Retro Hour podcast in around 20 minutes from now. Now, let's get straight into the stories this week because there's lots to get through. Actually, a really good week for news. And I don't know if any of you guys are into Lego.
I love Lego. Whenever I go to America, I always go to the Lego shops and come back with loads of overpriced Lego that I could have got in the UK. And I just get super excited for it. But I am massively hyped for the Lego NES, which is coming out. It looks absolutely amazing.
Now, this thing is 2,646 pieces. Now, if I tell you guys, I like the idea of Lego.
Yeah.
My missus bought me the Back to the Future DeLorean Lego, which I think is about 400 pieces.
Okay.
And I started building that in 2013 and still haven't finished it yet.
That sounds about right.
Got a few questions. So this is like a nice looking NES built out of Lego with a television. Does it work? Does it operate as an actual NES?
No. So essentially what it is it's 35 years since the NES came out, not the Famicom, but the NES. So it's to celebrate that. And it's coming out on the 1st of August. And it is fully Lego. It's not electrical. There's no electronics or anything like that in it. But what you do get with it, which is really cool, is you get a little 8-inch TV monitor, like an 80s style one. And that
with the old dial and everything, the rotary dial.
With the old rotary dial and everything like that. And then you get a cartridge. You get a Super Mario Brothers cartridge, which goes into the NES as well, which is really cool. But none of it's electrical. It's all just Lego bricks. But then what's on the side of the TV is like a hand-turning crank. And what that does is it's like the only way I can describe it is kind of like a show, but it is Super Mario Brothers. And it's like, how do you describe it, Dan?
Well, it's kind of the end of a level, isn't it?
Yeah, on like a roller, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as you turn the crank, the story, the frame moves, if that makes sense. So it scrolls.
It's like a diorama kind of.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I couldn't think of the word, but that's really, really, really cool. But like Dan says, it's 2,400 pieces. It's the kind of thing you're going to build. It's going to sit there, and then like your kids are going to want to play with it, and you're like, no, it's just for display purposes only.
And like you said, it's quite expensive because Lego always is. It's about £200 for this.
Yeah. Which actually, you look at some stuff. I mean, I was in. We went to Italy last year. I went to the Lego shop in Milan. I think it was on a day trip. And there was, they're like the Ghostbusters firehouse and stuff like that, these big models. Some of them were like, about €500.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like you said, there's a lot of pieces. I mean, it does, generally, Lego is quite pricey.
And it goes up in value as well. It keeps its value, like these kits. But I don't know if you guys have seen one called the Commodore Brixty 64.
No, I've not heard of that one.
So Perifractic Gaming, who we've actually had on the podcast, he built a C64 case out of Lego, and he's got designs that are available so you can get all the right bricks. But the best thing about his was it actually worked. You could put the board in, and the keyboard, the C64 keyboard, actually took Lego pieces amazingly well. So he's built a full keyboard. He's even got a little Lego SD card kind of reader as well. It's fantastic. So check out the C64 or Brixty 64.
I think that's the next step for Lego. Then they need to do a Lego Technics NES.
Someone's so gonna mod
fully functional.
Someone's so gonna mod this and put like a mini NES in there. Or something.
Yeah, probably.
Well, you may looking at the size of it. I mean, it looks kind of to scale. It looks like it's probably the same size as an original NES. So I imagine there's plenty of space inside it, for some enterprising person to do something like that. The only thing I think is, it's coming out on August 1st to celebrate, like you said, 35 years. The rate it takes me to build things out of Lego, it'll probably be another 35-year celebration of this Lego thing by the time I build it. But yeah, I do think it looks really cool. I might get one and just ask someone to build it for me. Anyone want to volunteer?
That's lazy.
Me and Ravi would do it for you.
Lego.
There you go. You've committed to that now.
I have committed to it now.
Now, probably one of the reasons that I don't get a lot of time to make things out of Lego is because, I'm too busy playing video games, of course. And one of my favourite genres is one of the most time-consuming forms of video games to play, point-and-click adventure games. Now, I know, Ravi, you're also a big fan of point-and-click adventure games. We've done episodes about LucasArts games and stuff in the past, and me and you were both hooked on Thimbleweed Park when that game came out a couple of years ago. Well, there is a really cool new game that's kind of inspired by classics like Maniac Mansion, and this is a game called Billy Masters Was Right. And if you look at it, it's kind of got that classic LucasArts kind of style, but also the colour palette on it reminds me a bit of like the Leisure Suit Larry games. It's got a lot of purples, a lot of blues, a lot of those primary colours in there as well. And the story is that Billy Masters is a teenager. He's been accused of smoking something he shouldn't during high school, and accusing his teacher of very serious crimes. And his parents are really sick of his attitude, and they've imposed a curfew on him until he apologises to his teacher. Now, he thinks a sneaky psycho is at work at his neighbours, and he'll do anything to convince the world that indeed Billy Masters was right all along. So essentially, this is a short adventure game where you've got to go around, you've got to find the clues and kind of solve this mystery, really, to prove his innocence.
It looks really cool, and like the color palette, it does look exactly like Maniac Mansion. Maniac Mansion. I always call it Manic Mansion, and it's got that kind of CGA look, and the way that the art's done really looks fantastic. If you're into that kind of stuff, I'd definitely go for this game.
What's really interesting about it as well, am I right in saying that this just plays in Windows? It's not come out on anything.
It's a free download for Windows.
For Windows, yeah. That's really cool.
15 meg as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. 15 meg. You look at it and I was thinking, God, that's tiny. But you remember stuff like Monkey Island 2. That was probably only about 11 megs, wasn't it? So,
Yeah.
for these kind of games, that probably is. There's quite a lot in there. But it is apparently quite a short game. But obviously, it's getting a great reaction. Looking at all the comments on the website here as well, people are loving it. So I'll give it a download. I'll have a play this weekend. Let you guys know what I think. But I always love to see the genre getting a bit of love as well, and especially there's something about those kind of old school, the ones that haven't got talking in them. You just got to kind of put yourself in there and read the text on screen. I was having to think about this the other day actually, because I was playing a few of the old Infocom Zork adventure games that are literally it's text on a black screen. No graphics, anything like that. But there is something about it. I kind of equate it to, the difference between watching a TV show, reading a book.
There's something quite immersive about it, isn't there? Yeah,
I think it's, the story all goes on in your brain then, doesn't it? So there is something I really like about these kind of classic kind of text-style adventure games. So I'll link that up in our show notes if you want to give it a try, and everything else we talk about this week at theretrohour.com. Now let's give a shout to a really cool project that I know you'll be really into, Ravi, and this is by a good friend of the show, Mike Clark. Of course, legendary musician, worked for Psygnosis back in the day. Also, probably his most famous work. Did the Retro Hour theme tune as well. Well, he's got a new plugin if you're a fan of SID music, and this is called Insidious.
Yeah, this looks absolutely wicked. So if you've got like a digital audio workstation nowadays, you get these plugins or like VSTs, and it's usually a virtual synthesizer. And this one seems to be totally about C64 and the SID sound. And I've seen a lot of plugins, and I've seen a lot of stuff that's claims to kind of recreate that sound, but it really doesn't. And it doesn't sound like the original stuff. A lot of the time I'm always on about the original hardware, but some of the stuff on this is absolutely amazing. And some of the people involved as well. You've got like sounds by Rob Hubbard, Martin Galway, Chris Hulsbeck, Mike Clark and TDK as well. So you've got a load of top artists here kind of getting involved, and it's fully compatible with all your MIDI and your NKS kind of stuff. So if you're really into your sound and you want to use your new equipment rather than get stuck into that old school tracking, then this is the way to go.
I mean, like you said, then looking at that list, I mean, Rob Hubbard, Chris Hulsbeck, TD, I mean, that is like a who's who of people that are famous in the Commodore 64 SID scene, isn't it? So having sounds and endorsement by those kind of people, that gives this a lot of credibility. And I mean, Mike Clark, also an amazing musician who's worked in video games for decades now as well. And I think, you make a good point there about the original hardware. I mean, it did have a kind of unique sound to it that even, the later Commodore 64 couldn't actually emulate all that well. You remember when the 64C came out and it changed the SID chip and it had like that really weird filter on it. And, to this day, SID purists won't go near that model of Commodore 64 just because it doesn't sound right. But a lot of effort has gone into this plugin to make it sound like that authentic, original, warm SID sound that, is really important if you're into doing that kind of music.
Yeah, it says it emulates it with ultimate precision, which is exactly what you need when you're kind of going for that retro sound.
So it's launched at $64 for the plugin, but there's an introduction sale on as well. So I'll link that up in our show notes if you want to check it out. Definitely worth doing if you're a fan of SID music. I mean, it's just nice than having to, there's only a limited amount of original SID chips, and I know there are millions of them, but, the break every day and people yank them out to put in different projects. So having something this accurate, I think, is really good. Now, what about using a Game Boy in quite a unique way? I don't imagine any of us guys are into stealing cars. I must admit, it's nothing I've ever taken part in the past. And we're not going to teach you how to do it. But so essentially, there's a device that looks like an old school Game Boy that is being used to commit Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, I've kind of seen these around. So I like looking at the darker side of stuff. And a lot of times there's been these jammers. And these jammers tend to jam keys on certain frequencies, and as cars turn a bit digital, your Tesla, you just turn it on with a tiny car. It's really weird. So as that comes out, there's always these jammers because it all kind of works on FM still, and it seems like someone's actually put one of these gadgets inside a Game Boy. So I assume that it's kind of so people can look like they're using a Game Boy and playing Tetris, and actually they're up to something very dodgy and illegal.
Well, what makes me laugh about this was me and Ravi were talking about it earlier on. These devices are actually completely legal to buy in Bulgaria where this happened. And it just says on their website when you buy it, like, this should not be used for criminal intent. Like, that's all it says. Like, make sure you don't break the law with this.
It's very weird, the laws, because a lot of stuff's legal to buy. So I could buy an FM transmitter, but as long as I didn't plug it in and turn it on, it would be fully legal. Really weird.
So bizarre.
Yeah, I remember reading. We've talked about the Jolly Rogers cookbook before, or the Anarchist cookbook, as it was also known, and this was a collection of essentially text documents that circulated on a load of different platforms back in the 80s and 90s. And I remember having a few friends of mine had discs of this at school, and it would be like really weird stuff on there, like how to make dodgy devices at home with things that you could never get your hands on. It was like just take 2 drops of plutonium and then you've got your own stuff you're never going to have access to.
It was the first published book online, actually. If you look on Vice, there's an absolutely amazing documentary about the guy that created the Anarchist cookbook and how he totally kind of regrets it now, and how it wasn't intended to be used in that kind of way. But I'd say the equivalent of this would be the guy sitting outside McDonald's in the 80s and taking over the little thing where you talk to the cars and putting in stupid orders and annoying the people.
Only slightly more expensive
version.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, with the Anarchist cookbook, when you loaded that up, you got that disclaimer on there that this is just for educational purposes. Like, don't carry any of it out. So, if you see someone hanging around the expensive car playing a Game Boy, be very suspicious.
By the Porsche garage.
Does it actually play the Tetris music?
I don't know when it unlocks the car.
Can you imagine?
Oh, the little Mario. And these devices are not cheap. Apparently they sell for £20,000. So, the most expensive Game Boy ever. If you have got that kind of money, though, maybe you'd rather spend it on an original sealed Super Mario Brothers game. Now, it seems every time we talk about these, classic games in good condition that are sold for a massive amount of money, they just seem to get more and more ridiculous prices. Now, this one, apparently they're saying, is officially the most expensive video game ever sold at public auction. A copy went for over £90,000. What's so special about this?
Well, this is the funny thing. So it is sealed, obviously, and it's an original 1985 Super Mario Brothers copy. And what I think is quite funny about it is I'm fairly certain this is the same copy that popped up on the show Pawn Stars last year, where a guy came in and he wanted $1 million for it. And they were like, look, you can sell this on an auction site or something. I'm sure you'll get a lot of money for it, but maybe not $1 million. But what's really interesting about it, what Ravi told me, which I think is absolutely hilarious, is the reason it went for so much. And apparently it's just because it's got the label hanger on it.
Oh, the little hang tags.
Yeah.
So basically, I think it's when you hang it on the shelf.
Yeah.
On that metal spike.
On the metal spike, you push that little bit of cardboard out, and that's a hang tag. And I think it's retained that, so it hasn't been put on a shelf, and it's crazy that gives it value.
I get it, kind of. I mean, it's a 35-year-old game, and they're never going to make any more of that kind of vintage, obviously. And there can't be many of them out there that are still completely intact the way they left the factory. But, seeing them go for that kind of money. I mean, do you think this is something that, in 35 years from now are like, Switch games that are sealed going to hold that kind of value?
I don't think so personally, because of obviously, I don't know, saying that, I was about to say the whole, like, we manufacture so many more Switch games these days, compared to games back then and stuff, but it's Super Mario Bros. There must be tens of millions of them out there, so I don't know. It's a hard one to say.
I think it's like the Beatles. Like the Beatles records will always be valuable because they were so big and they were like huge worldwide. And Super Mario Bros. Was like so iconic that, having copies of that is without a scratch or without this kind of stuff is going to always be a record-breaking kind of a sale.
Yeah, and I guess when it's the first game in such an infamous franchise like that, I mean, imagine the 15th Mario game probably isn't quite as collectible as the first ever one.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
But yeah, it makes you wonder who's buying it for this kind of money and why.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about it a couple of months ago. There was that dentist who spent $1 million on like 15 games or something like that. But he was doing it because he was like a collector already of like baseball cards, and he did it because he felt the value would increase. It wasn't because he was a video game collector. It was more just these are the new antiques. But it doesn't say in the article who's bought this or anything like that. It's just a private collector who's bought it. So I'm hoping it's there to go into a private collection. It's not a case of I'm buying this so I can sell it for 200,000 in 35 years time kind of thing. So
see, that's it. A lot of people are treating them like an investment now. I mean, looking at stories like this, I think even if I had that kind of money, I'm not sure whether I'd actually want to do that. Or to me, it just feels like, you're buying some. I get the kind of displaying your collection, it's cool, and owning something that a lot of gamers would want. But when it gets into that kind of money, I mean, the other day I was looking at there's a variant of the Amiga mouse that I want to complete my collection. I want the white tank mouse for the Amiga 600. And I thought I've got a lot of the cream ones, but not the white model. I looked on eBay and there's one for 30 quid on there, and I thought, oh, that's a bit pricey. Even though it's the first one I've seen on eBay in about 3 or 4 years separately. Yeah. So it's, it's hard to justify, even if I think you can kind of scale your finances to it. I don't know. I guess everyone's different though.
Let's say we're in Nottingham in the UK. That's 90,000 is probably a 2-bedroom house.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If I've got 90 grand spare to buy video games with, I wouldn't want to buy one game. I want to buy like I'd want to finish like an entire collection of like for Nintendo. Do you know what I mean? So it's I don't know. This guy's obviously got a lot of money.
I can almost guarantee the guy that's bought this probably does have the entire collection.
Yeah,
and everything else.
Yeah, so, more than likely.
And it probably cost him like $5,000.
We're just jealous. We're just jealous.
Yeah, that's all it is.
So yeah, if you are listening and you bought it, get in touch and let us know why. We're interested.
Now, buy some of our games.
Yeah, Joe's got a big game collection. Right, now, before we get into our chat with Jaz Rignall this week, talking about the golden age of video game journalism, it's always cool when we see new releases for our favourite consoles as well. And our good friends at Mega Cat Studios, I mean, we've done episodes with them in the past, and they're like the guys who release a lot of games for the Mega Drive/Genesis. And there is a great little collection that you can buy from them at the moment, containing 3 games. Now, these are sold separately, but these are games that haven't been released on the Mega Drive before. Now, the first one is called Yazzie, and this is a platformer about a gold digger who finds himself deep in a mansion full of treasure and danger. I was looking at this and I thought, that sounds a bit familiar. I did a bit of Googling, and this game also came out on the Spectrum about 2 years ago, and it was released on the MSX as well around Christmas time.
All right.
So this, it looks like it's it's been released on a few platforms, but the Mega Drive version looks really colourful. You got another one called Gluff, that's a puzzle platformer about a Tesla frog, which is a unique electrical creature that has to power up sections of each level to proceed while staying charged up himself. Sounds quite original. Then you got one called Arcagis Revolution, that's kind of like a top-down shooter game as well. These games are selling for $50 each, which actually, if you look at it, these are boxed original Mega Drive cartridges that, come in the nice packaging, look like they could have been released in like 1992. That great quality, got the manual in there as well, the inlays, all full colour.
Yeah, and you can get them for $40 as well if you just want to get the cart. But that's pretty close to the original price of Mega Drive games, isn't it?
Well, if you think of inflation, it's a lot cheaper. I mean, Mega Drive games back then were like 55, 60 quid. That in today's money would be like double that easily. So,
and they've got nice little features. Like I really like the 50 hertz to 60 hertz speed correction. I think that's really thoughtful.
Yeah, they're completely like worldwide region free compatible, aren't they? Like they play on any Mega Drive or Genesis, which I think is quite cool.
It's really weird. It's only really since YouTube came around that I've kind of known about that kind of 50, 60 hertz kind of rivalry. Because, now if you're watching it on YouTube and like, you all see it in the comments, if someone uploads like a video of the PAL version of Sonic the Hedgehog, everyone's like, oh, yuck, it's slow Sonic. But, to me as a kid, that's how it was meant to be. And then when I eventually saw the NTSC version, I was like, oh, that's running a bit fast.
Yeah, well, interesting you should say that. When I had a GameCube and Mario Kart Double Dash came out, my friend used to come over and he used to moan if we played on 50 hertz because he was like, oh, that's the slow version. And we didn't know what that was about. And he was just like, just put it on 60 hertz. It makes the game faster. So we're like, okay. So we just used to play it on 60 hertz, thinking it just made the game faster, and we didn't know why.
But it changes everything, like the music and everything, doesn't it? It all runs a bit faster. It's like, when the first time I heard it, I was like, that's not right. But yeah, there are people that just like won't look at the PAL versions anymore these days. So yeah, it's good they've included that feature. And I think, $50, it's more than reasonable for, the amount of effort that goes into these products. So if you want to get hold of them, there's 3 of them out, separate cartridges. I'll put that in our show notes. And all the other stories we chatted about this week at theretrohour.com. Now, that is also the same place. If you want to help out with this podcast, help us keep going, help with our studio build project that we've got on at the moment as well. Obviously, we've got a Patreon running, and thank you so much. We say it every week, but we really, really do appreciate your support on this. And of course, every penny that we're getting through Patreon, it's all going to be reinvested in the future of this podcast. So we're not making any profit off or anything like that. Literally, it's a crowdfunded effort. We're all chipping in. I've bought the equipment for our new studio. We just need help with the rent and getting it built, essentially. So that's where you guys come in, and we really appreciate your help so far. And every week, we give big shout-outs in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. We try and get through as many as we can. And this week, let's give a big shout to a very good friend, Neil from Retro Man Cave.
Yeah, Neil's absolutely amazing. He's just been doing a Kickstarter, and oh my God, it's really kicking off. Check it out. It's his retro tea breaks, and basically he gets a selection of guests, and he's put the interviews in book form.
Yes, if you like our show, then definitely worth checking that out. He also popped into our Patrons Hangout last month for about 20 minutes as well, didn't he?
Yeah, man, yeah.
And also thank you to Chris Riley,
Dirk Zygart,
Alan Pudom,
and Oliver Masood, who all made donations into the running of the show. And if you'd like to do the same, we'd really, really appreciate it. You'll find it on our website at theretrohour.com. Speaking of Patrons Hangout, we're going to do another one this coming Sunday evening. So if you're a patron, you'll find the link in there. 8 o'clock Sunday night, we're all going to hang out, just chat about retro. All 3 of us on there, so it's always a giggle. If you haven't joined us before, sign up to the Patreon. I mean, literally, it'll cost you like the price of a cup of coffee once a month, and you can join us on there as well. Plenty more perks. You'll find that all at theretrohour.com. Right, then coming up next, we are going to be joined by gaming journalist rockstar Julian Jazz Rignall is our special guest next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. Now today, we're going to be returning to the golden age of video games magazines with an absolute legend of a journalist and one of our most in-demand guests. It's our pleasure to welcome him to the Retro Hour podcast. Julian Rignall, welcome to the show, Jazz.
Hello, and thank you for the very warm welcome. I appreciate that.
Well, we're going to get into some stories about your time working on magazines like ZZap and Mean Machines and Games Master that we can't wait to hear about. I mean, the thing is, whenever, we see you mentioned in the retro gaming community, you're always known as the most famous mullet in gaming in the 80s and 90s, which I imagine the mullet's long gone now, yeah?
Yeah, that's very long gone. I lost that in the early 90s when I moved out to the States and realized that it was incredibly uncool at that point. So I had it chopped off. But it was a legendary mullet. It was quite spectacular, especially in the late 90s. The late 80s, when I had hair down to my backside, basically, and a short front. So, and something that I'm not exactly proud of, but it sticks in people's minds, the crazy hair that we had when we were working on magazines back in the day.
It was like Dave Perry's bandana, your identifying kind of thing.
Yeah, it was definitely a trademark of my style back then. That and the rugby shirts I was known for wearing. And it was weird that people honed in on specific sort of characteristics of us, and remember those fondly. But I can't complain. That's cool.
Well, let's get into your kind of history with gaming. I mean, what kind of originally got you into video games? Where did your story start with it?
Well, I started when I was a very young kid back in, I think the first video game I played was probably in 1976. So that ages me badly. I grew up in a seaside town in Aberystwyth on the west coast of Wales, and we had a local arcade, and I used to visit that regularly and play a lot of the electromechanical games that they had. And then some of the early video games like Combat, Pong, I remember playing, and the circus game. And so I kind of really was fascinated by video games turned out to be very good at them. And I won the 1983 Computer and Video Games National Arcade Championships. And that was pretty amazing experience. And from that, I started to write about how to play video games, and people weren't really writing hints and tips much at the time. So Computer and Video Games basically printed some of my hints and tips, and that got noticed by other magazine editors, specifically Chris Anderson, who was at Personal Computer Games. And I basically got invited to another tournament at that magazine in late 1984. From that, again, I kind of started writing hints and tips on playing games for that magazine. And Chris Anderson, basically the magazine got closed down, and Chris Anderson got the job to start Zap 64 magazine. And he wanted real gamers rather than sort of journalist turned gamers for the magazine. And he gave me a call one night, just out of the blue, and said, was I interested in writing for the magazine? And I said, of course, yes. I couldn't believe my luck because I was unemployed at the time and living in Aberystwyth. There weren't many employment opportunities. And went for an interview down in London, and he liked me and thought that I was the right stuff. And so I started on Zap magazine in February in 1985.
Well, you must have had a home system because you couldn't get to the arcades all the time. So what were you kind of playing on back then?
My first computer game system was an Atari 400. I bought that from a friend of a friend who was a student who blew his student grant on weed and video games, basically, and ran out of money and decided to sell the system to me to raise some funds so that he could actually get home that term. And so I got that, and he had a whole bunch of games with it. He spent quite a lot of money on it, and I got it dirt cheap, so I was very lucky. So that's where I first started playing, and played a lot of the Atari soft conversions of Williams and Atari coin ops, like Joust and things like that. After that, I got a ZX Spectrum. I had that for a year or so. And those are the two systems that I had. But mainly, I used to spend a lot of time in the arcades. I used to bunk off school a lot and do sort of all-day marathons playing games like Defender and Missile Command and Asteroids. So I was playing games all of the time. So I had a sort of scope for writing hints and tips for PCG and CMVG, and that's what really brought me to the attention of Chris Anderson, who hired me.
I think it's great that you're a very skilled game player as well. I mean, you mentioned then about some of the records you held. You actually had world records and game high scores on several games.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they were world records at this point. I mean, at the time, CMVG was tracking high scores, and I used to get a newsletter from America that tracked high scores. And so some of my early scores were definitely very, very high on games like Defender and Asteroids. And I kind of think that some of them were world records, but they were never verified, so I don't really know. But bottom line was I was able to play games like Defender for 18 hours non-stop, and I could just keep playing forever, really, until I fell asleep.
Wow.
and Asteroids was another one that I could play all day. Missile Command was a little bit more difficult because the game would reset if you got too many extra lives. So you had to manage your extra lives very carefully and make sure that you didn't earn more than 255 cities. Otherwise, the machine would reset. So that was a little bit more difficult to play all day because of trying to keep track of the extra lives and the game potentially resetting.
I think I struggled to get about 18 seconds on Defender, so you did a lot better than me.
Well, did you feel that this was like a career path? Because nowadays, the career for video games journalists is like a real set path. Back then, it must have seemed really speculative.
Yeah, I mean, the old cliche of video games won't get you anywhere was told to me by several of my teachers who sort of fed up with me disappearing off school grounds, and they knew where I was, and they'd say it's not going to get you anywhere. But I really felt that it was a valid career. There were people at that time, the first generation of journalists were making money writing about video games, and I just felt like, why can't I do this? I'm good at playing games. I was good at writing. I'd always done well with English in school. So, like I said, I started contributing freelance-wise and got a little bit of money from doing that, and managed to turn it into a full-time job, which was very unusual at the time for sure. But it felt like a proper career path.
I mean, you mentioned then that was quite interesting about the fact that a lot of people said, video games will get you nowhere. A lot of people thought that there'd only be a bit of a flash in the pan and only around for a couple of years. I mean, did you kind of see the industry lasting like as long as it has, or what did you think?
Yeah, very much. I thought it was here to stay. When I was, I remember sort of in the early to mid 80s, before I joined ZZap 64 magazine, I would sort of imagine what video games would be like. And, I would play things like the Star Wars Atari arcade game and think, at some point in the future, this is going to be what video games are like at home, only they're going to be even bigger, and the spaceships are going to be bigger, and you're going to be able to fly around them, and it'll be all in 3D. So I always felt that video games had a huge amount of potential, and that it was just a case of the technology becoming available and getting faster processors and all the rest of it, and that we would see more and more sophisticated video games. So I never had any doubt that it was here to stay and would always just continue to improve.
Well, you mentioned ZZap 64 there, and that was an absolutely legendary magazine. How did you get working there, and what was it like? What was the atmosphere like there?
It was quite strange. I started working there in early 1985, and literally sort of came off the little farm that I grew up in mid Wales and started on this magazine. And, within the first couple of days, I was reviewing games, and, it was, the learning experience was quite tough. It was almost like an apprenticeship. I would sort of write these reviews and send them into Chris Anderson, who would edit it and send it back and say, you need to expand on this. You're criticizing this element of the game, but you're not really giving any solutions. And he really taught us how to, sort of review and criticize games and in a sort of positive way. If you were going to criticize a feature, then you better kind of come up with some reason why it's that way and try and explain how it should be and what would make it better. So that was sort of ingrained in us from the very beginning. And it was an interesting sort of learning process. At the time I had, it was difficult for me to take feedback because I was so young, and I kind of thought that I was writing these great reviews, and looking back at them, they were probably pretty ropey. But I eventually learned and sort of picked up the craft. And after, I guess it took about 6 months to really get into the general swing of things. But once I did, I felt that our reviews were very honest and on point, and were quite critical, but like I said, in a sort of a more positive way.
I know in the school playground then, it was kind of like, the ZX Spectrum versus the Commodore 64. That was always like I saw fist fights erupt over that. I mean, was there much rivalry in the magazine industry? Did you see stuff like, Crash and Commodore User as like real proper, like bitter rivals? What was it kind of like?
Internally at Newsfield, there was we would sort of take the piss out of each other, in terms of sort of, the Spectrum isn't as good, and sometimes the Spectrum game would come along like an ultimate game, and we'd recognize it as being very good, but we'd still take the piss out of it. So there was a little bit of, it wasn't really rivalry, it was just more of sort of Mickey taking more than anything. The real rivalry we had with that was with rival publications like Commodore User. We came out of nowhere and started selling magazines quite strongly. And I think our style was seen as very jarring. It was very personality driven. we weren't real journalists. We were sort of gamers turned journalists. So I think they sort of, Commodore user especially, sort of disparaged us a fair bit. And Commodore User International called us a fluffy lollipop magazine. It just little things like that, where you could tell that there was sort of some sort of rivalry there. And we eventually became the top selling magazine. And, they'd write little gossip pieces about us and stuff. Nothing too untoward, but there was definitely some strong rivalries between Commodore User and Zap 64 for sure.
Were there any goals at Zap to kind of cover more Amiga stuff?
Yeah, that was sort of an interesting situation. Sort of after Zap had been around for about 3 years and the Amiga really started to take off, I really wanted to cover the Amiga in Zap 64 magazine, but the readership was kind of split over it. Around about half the readership didn't want to see any Amiga coverage at all, and about half the readership wanted to see Amiga coverage. So we did cover the Amiga for a little while, but the decision came down on high to not cover it anymore. I'm not exactly sure what the reason for that was. Maybe they got some, too much negative feedback about the Amiga coverage. But I really wanted to, I felt that it was the future of Zap 64 was to cover the Amiga as well. And it eventually did become Zap 64 Amiga, but not before I sort of left the magazine and joined CMBG. Partly because I wanted to write about other systems other than the Commodore 64. And I just was kind of, after writing for the Commodore 64 for about almost 3.5 to 4 years, I was just sort of bored of the machine. I'd sort of seen the glory days of the system and sort of gone through some of the best games that had been released for the machine. And I just wanted to move on. And I was very excited about the consoles that were coming out, like the PC Engine. They just seemed really interesting and exciting to me. I owned a Nintendo Entertainment System and a Sega Master System. And I love both of those machines too. And I just felt that if I couldn't write about them in Zap 64 and I couldn't write about the Amiga, then, it was time for me to go.
I do remember in Zap, you did occasionally cover other Commodore machines because my brother had a Commodore 64, but I was a kid with the Commodore Plus 4.
Oh, dear.
So I remember you once did a pull-out about Commodore 16 and Plus 4 games, but there wasn't a lot of coverage.
No, it was, the name of the magazine was Zap 64, and that's what Ollie and Roger, the owners of Newsfield, used to argue. It's a Commodore 64 magazine. That's what it's known for, and that's what we should stick to. And like I said, I just became sort of tired of the Commodore 64 and felt like the software was becoming a little bit samey to me. And having read about the PC Engine in a Computer and Video Games magazine, and seeing the pictures of R-Type in particular, that just totally turned my head. It's like, wow, these are sort of almost arcade perfect conversions. This is what I want to play. This is what I want to write about. And so I left Zap and joined Computer and Video Games.
When you got to Computer and Video Games, was that a big change from Zap? We had Steve Jarrett on the show last year, and he was saying that EMAP at the time were all on typewriters.
Yep, that is absolutely correct. It was quite a shock. It was very much a sort of a National Union of Journalists run traditional sort of news outlet. And so we used typewriters initially, which just seemed totally insane to me. The process of making the magazine was basically the same way that it had been done for decades. And we'd used word processors and sort of direct typesetting output coding to produce Zap 64 and Crash magazines, which were quite advanced at the time. So it definitely felt like going a step back and having to sort of write something on a typewriter, take it to the typesetters, have the typesetter then input that into the typesetting machine, print it out. We'd then have to go through what were called the galleys, which were the printouts of the reviews, and correct them, have them sent back. And it was just a process that went on and on and on. And it was just so slow compared to, being able to simply write something and spell check it and be able to re-edit it without having to use Tipex or some other sort of whiteout. It definitely felt ridiculous using typewriters, but that was we only did that for a couple of years, and then my endless whining at my publisher to set us up on desktop publishing systems was ultimately heeded, especially when I figured out that we could produce pages far, far cheaper and far more efficiently than the old typesetting process. So we got this new technology in, and by the time we started producing Mean Machines magazine, it was all done using technology, modern day technology. So the magazine was definitely all the better for it.
And I bet the office was a bit quieter as well.
Yeah, most certainly. We did have these amazing, the sort of cutting edge typewriters that did actually have delete buttons, so you could backspace a little bit. It wasn't like a full editing machine, but you could, if you made a mistake, you could backspace and it would automatically white out a letter. So they were cool machines, built like tanks, but certainly their time had come by the time desktop publishing software was available, and it transformed the way that we made magazines.
Well, CVG was multi-platform. Was the kind of balancing act between systems really hard?
Yeah, it was, what we just tended to cover what we felt was the hottest thing that month, regardless of platform. So, while we would sort of try and obviously strike a balance between, making sure that we had ZX Spectrum reviews and Commodore 64 reviews and Amiga reviews, so there was something for everybody. We also had the Mean Machines column, which that's where the magazine started. And, when it first started, nobody was that interested in console games at all. But through that sort of constantly writing about these exciting new machines that were coming out, like the PC Engine, people began to get excited about them, and hype began to finally build for these new machines that are coming out, and the Mega Drive and eventually the Super Nintendo. So in some respects, it was a case of sort of balancing existing formats with sort of the exciting new, what was the sort of the dawn of the console era. And writing about that and sort of building reader excitement for those machines, almost creating demand for them.
Magazines were so important back then. And they're really good. You can make or break a game or a system, with a good review or a bad review. What was your relationship like with publishers then? And did they ever try and bribe you in any ways to get good reviews or anything? Did they ever try any tricks?
Generally, we had good relationships with publishers for the most part. Occasionally we'd write a bad review and we'd get the inevitable phone call saying, what went wrong with the game? Why didn't you like it? But for the most part, they were fairly hands-off. US Gold was probably the most hands-on sort of, they pulled ads from the magazine a few times for us giving games bad reviews, particularly sort of the Tier Tex arcade conversions of the late 90s that were really shoddy and badly put together. We'd absolutely roast those and say they were crap. And, we'd get the inevitable phone call from US Gold saying, that's it, we're pulling ads from your magazine, for the foreseeable future. They'd always come back after a couple of months, they'd forgive us, or we'd review something by them and give it a good score. But occasionally we'd negotiate exclusives. I remember us negotiating an exclusive of Ghostbusters by Activision, and they gave us the game, and lo and behold, when the magazine came out, they'd also given the game to Commodore User, and I forget what other magazine it was, but there were basically 3 covers with Ghostbusters all saying exclusive review, and that really annoyed us, and sort of caused us not to trust Activision for a good few years after that, because they sort of stitched us up just to get a cover story on multiple magazines. But
that's a dirty trick there.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't good. But in terms of sort of bribes and stuff like that, that didn't really happen. We did get, sent obviously, loads of freebies and T-shirts, and got taken to places. Sega took me to the Monaco Grand Prix to launch the Game Gear, which was one of my favorite sort of freebies I ever got. A free trip to Monaco basically for the weekend and watch the Grand Prix. That nowadays, that would be very much frowned upon. But back then it wasn't seen as, it was just seen as a promotional thing that, you go to this event, we'd talk about it in the magazine and post pictures of us, doing these events. And it was publicity for the company. And, it didn't really change our point of view at all about the game. If the game came out, we'd still slate it, even if we'd been on some swanky event or been sent some really nice freebies or T-shirts or whatever, because, we couldn't, you can't sell your credibility. All it takes is one review saying that the game is good when it's actually bad, and that's your credibility absolutely blown completely. And something that we noticed sort of back in the day was when we sort of used to do research on readers, it would only take them to buy 2 games on a review based on that you'd done, and that they didn't like those, they didn't agree with the review. If we said a game was good and the reader bought a game, the second time that happened, they would stop reading the magazine. So we kind of realized very early on that we had to try and get our reviews on target. People would always disagree with our reviews. There were always people that sort of, wouldn't like a particular game or whatever. But they would kind of come back to the magazine, but they wouldn't be as trusting on the reviews as they were before, because games were quite, £10 for a game, particularly for a Commodore game, was a lot of pocket money for a kid. So having that trust with the magazine was very important, and for the magazine to have the reader's trust was also, very important. And so reviews, really, we had to be very careful with what we said with our reviews to try and make sure that we were being perfectly fair. Very long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully I'm making my point.
Well, you were working in a really kind of transitional period from 8-bit to 16-bit. How was that, and kind of covering that period and all the hype at the time?
Oh, it was really exciting. I mean, it still, to me, is the most exciting period of sort of writing about video games for me personally. There were just so many new things going on between sort of 1989 and about 1992. Sort of we essentially went from ZX Spectrums and sort of Commodore 64s and Amigas to PC Engine and Mega Drive. Also, it was the dawn of handheld machines like the Game Boy and the Lynx, and those were very exciting. We even had sort of early VR machines. Arcade machines were getting very sort of exciting and cutting edge during that period. And there were just not lesser known, but sort of lesser successful consoles like the Neo Geo to write about. There was just a tremendous amount of change in technology with the advent of CD-ROMs and things like that. You could just see that gaming was in the midst of a huge transition of technology, going from sort of cassette loading to CD-ROMs in the space of, just a sort of 3 or 4 years. So it was just tremendously exciting. Every month there seemed like something new and cool was happening.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that it all happened in such a short space of time. I guess you're right, we went from playing games like, like you said, Ghostbusters on the Commodore 64 to like games like, Seventh Guest and Myst and stuff like that within less than a decade. It was crazy, really.
Yeah, I mean, Seventh Guest when was that? 1993?
93, I want to say.
Yeah. So it was a space of sort of almost 5 or 6 years, and just tremendous acceleration of technology and sort of and gaming sort of concepts moving forward at a tremendous rate, and really shifting. I kind of look at the sort of that sort of early to mid 90s as a sort of transitional point between sort of really old school gaming and sort of more like the modern era of gaming, where it definitely felt a lot more modern.
Well, it must have been a really exciting time to work on Mean Machines. I mean, like you said before, that started life in CVG. How did it develop into its own title then?
That was quite a lot of pestering of the publisher, of CMVG's publisher, by me. In early 1990, we were getting a lot of letters and feedback from the Mean Machines column in Computer and Video Games. It was becoming increasingly clear that consoles were going to be the next big thing. I really believed that in my heart. And so, I said to CMVG's publisher, let's make a magazine. And he was hesitant at first, which, was his job. He is his job to make successful, profitable magazines. And he wasn't quite sure whether the advertising market was really there for it. So we started producing these one-off magazines called The Complete Guide to Consoles, the Computer and Video Games Complete Guide to Consoles, with a Mean Machines logo on it. And those all sold incredibly well. And we also got advertising pages booked in them. So it was a proof of concept, essentially. It was clear that there was a readership out there that was interested in consoles enough to buy a magazine about it. So by the summer, we got the green light to go ahead and make a dummy version of Mean Machines, which is like a sample copy of the magazine, basically. 16 pages of sample editorial reprinted to make it into, over and over again, to make it into a magazine that we could then give to advertisers and test with readers to see whether they responded well to it. And the focus groups we did with that magazine were very, very positive indeed. So the magazine got the green light from Lord EMAP, and we launched it in October of 1990. And it sold really well right out of the gate. And in fact, the magazine sold out completely of its print run for the first 5 or 6 months, and we just kept printing more and more and more. And it was just clear that the magazine was just very popular and seemed to strike a chord with its readers, and was sort of passed around the playground. And everyone that sort of saw the magazine, not everyone, but lots of people that saw the magazine wanted it and would go out and buy it the following month for themselves. So it had this sort of exponential growth curve that put it on the path of becoming Britain's best-selling magazine, full stop.
Yeah, it was selling
in the computer and video game category. Obviously, there were other magazines that sold better than us, but
well, it was enormously successful. EMAP must have been very happy because it was selling 150,000 a month at one point.
Yeah, absolutely, and EMAP made absolute bank out of it. And EMAP was sort of broken up into these little sort of mini companies almost, where you had the sort of the car magazines and motorcycle magazines were one part of EMAP, and the computer titles were EMAP Images, which is another part of EMAP. And really, Mean Machines helped, and Computer and Video Games success really sort of helped put that part of EMAP on the map. And they invested, wanted us to produce more magazines. So, we launched Megatech and eventually split Mean Machines up into the official Nintendo magazine and Mean Machines Sega, because we could see there was an increasing market, and specializing the magazines would help them sell more, which they did, even though by splitting Mean Machines into two magazines, we kind of lost a little bit of what made the original run of Mean Machines really great, because the teams were split up and we were on different floors, and we lost some of its personality, really. It was still a fun magazine. Mean Machines Sega, I still put a lot of time into and very fond of, but it just wasn't quite as anarchic and funny as the original Mean Machines was.
Well, speaking of funny parts of the magazine, the Mean Yob letters page, that can be brutal. Did you have fun writing that, and any things that stick in your mind about it? Any memorable examples?
Oh, God. Yeah, I always used to do it at the end of the month, and sort of right when the magazine was about to finish. It was one of the last things I would do. So I was always pretty manic when I was writing the responses, and it was just weird sort of going into that Mean Yob mindset. I'd put myself into sort of a mindset of if a letter was positive and fun, it would get a positive and fun response. And if the letter was critical, then obviously, we'd be critical back. So we used to make fun of readers' names and say sort of things that probably would be politically incorrect these days. We weren't overly racist or really unkind or anything like that. We would just sort of, call people spazzes and stuff like that, sort of not the sort of thing you do these days. But it was just a sort of, it was done in a way to sort of be very interactive and to try and promote readers to be original when they sent in letters, to sort of, and to understand what would happen when they did send in letters. If readers would definitely send in letters deliberately to goad us and to get a response out of me and Yob. And that was really fun, sort of sparring with readers that take the piss out of us and we'd take the piss out of them back.
And it gave us all a good giggle in the playground, so you did your job well.
I mean, that was ultimately the objective, was to try and be as funny as possible and make people laugh. And a lot of the humour was sort of very much inspired by things like Vic Reeves' Big Night Out and Friday Night Live, the sort of the comedy shows of the era. Sort of that combined with the banter, the sort of the inter-office banter that constantly flew around, where we were always taking a piss out of each other and coming up with new ways of insulting one another. A lot of the insults that you saw in Mean Yob were originally used on Mean Machine's staff members by one another. So, it was... It was fun sort of getting to be creative and sort of and taking a piss in that kind of way.
Well, were there any systems that you thought would be really big and kind of failed abysmally? Like, I remember there was the GX4000 on the front cover.
Yeah, that was very much against my wishes. I wanted to put a PC Engine on the cover of the magazine, but the publisher insisted on the GX4000 because he believed that we were going to get some advertisements for it and that the machine was going to be moderately popular. Yeah, he was wrong, of course. And, we ended up with a bit of egg on our faces putting GX4000 on the cover. I can't remember whether we actually reviewed any games, and we might have reviewed a game in issue 1, but there were virtually no games for it. And, we didn't believe in it at all. We were thinking, well, the publisher was also thinking of putting the Commodore 64, whatever it was called, the
game system thing.
Yeah,
yeah.
He was thinking of
the GS, wasn't it?
Yeah, putting that on the cover as well. And I'm certainly glad we didn't do that. I mean, that was pretty much dead the moment it arrived. I remember sitting down and explaining to him why this console wasn't going to work, and he kind of said, "All right, fair enough. We'll just stick with the NES, the Master System, the Mega Drive, and the GX4000 on the cover." So, thank God for that.
Well, Future launched the official Sega magazine. I mean, essentially that competed with Mean Machines. So why did that kind of happen, and why didn't Mean Machines ever become official in the same way the Nintendo magazine did?
I'm not sure. Future, I mean, obviously, was doing its own thing at the time, and it had Sega Power, and that was the main competitor to Mean Machines. Mean Machines launched first and really demonstrated that there was a big market for console magazines. And so Future started launching, and I can't remember which magazines came out and when, but Sega Power was a very early Future magazine, and Total was also the unofficial Nintendo magazine. And, they were good magazines. They were sort of very 90s style. I think I would like to think that, that some of Mean Machines sort of anarchic style was sort of influenced some of the way that Sega Power was written and presented. I think at that point, we demonstrated that humor and interactivity was very important for a magazine at that point. So, the Future guys were smart and picked up on that and made their magazines also very interactive and sort of fun to read. So, Mean Machines always sold a little bit more than Sega Power, but, we were in competition with one another, but it was more friendly competition, definitely more friendly than sort of ZZap and Commodore user were. The sort of the team members of Sega Power and Mean Machines would often go to similar events and see one another. So we kind of became friends. We had a lot of commonalities working as we did on magazines, and sort of had similar points of view about the readers and certain video games and certain personalities within the games industry that we would deal with on a regular basis, like PR people and stuff. So, there was a lot for us. We had a lot in common. So, inevitably, we would sort of be very friendly towards one another when we went to events and things like that.
Well, you ended up appearing not just in magazines, but also on the television, doing Games Master. How did you kind of land that gig? You ended up being the resident reviewer. Yeah,
that was interesting. I remember getting a phone call out of the blue from the production company that makes Games Master, and they just said, we're producing a TV show, and you're obviously very well known in magazine circles as being a reviewer, and we'd like to you to appear on the show. Would you be interested in doing so? So of course, it was a no-brainer. Yeah, definitely wanted to do it, and it was good publicity for the magazine. Didn't get paid for doing any of it. It was just all done on for free essentially. But we got to publicize our magazines to a TV audience, and that just helped us grow our circulations a bit. So while we didn't benefit from doing it personally, it did benefit the magazines for sure. So yeah, I started I was doing all sorts of TV in the sort of that period of the early to mid 90s. I did quite a few different sort of daytime chat shows on video games, and quickly found out that they were incredibly challenging to do. But it sort of shows like about, my son is addicted to video games, and I'm worried that it's going to, affect him in a bad way. And I would go on these shows and defend video games, these sort of talk shows. But it was always difficult dealing with emotional people and sort of trying to come up with these logical responses, basically saying, you're talking nonsense. Video games aren't harmful to kids, and not going to turn your kid into a zombie or a raving lunatic. I was doing things like that, and also I'd whenever there was a major news story, I'd go on BBC Radio or the BBC News briefly to sort of give perspective on a new console or a new game that was very popular. So I was doing all sorts of stuff at the time. It was really fun.
Well, there were some huge gaming events in that era too. I remember stuff like, obviously, we had Sonic Tuesday, Mortal Monday. Are there any kind of memorable launches for you around that time?
It's weird because of the nature of sort of writing about video games, the launches didn't make much, not much sense, but they kind of didn't make much impact with us because they were more focused towards our readers. So we would write about Sonic Tuesday. But when it happened, we'd already had those games for months and had reviewed them and played them to death. So it sort of, while we recognise them as being great, momentous occasions, they didn't have much impact to the magazine personally because, sort of, like I said, we'd already played the games and weren't anticipating them like the readership was. Who went out on that first day and bought whatever it was, Sonic the Hedgehog, with their pocket money, and went home, and it was a sort of a defining moment of their video gaming life to do that. So we don't quite have those same memories, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, you left the UK to move to the US and work for Virgin. How did that move come about, and what convinced you to make that move?
I was actually sent on assignment to Virgin Interactive in Southern California. They'd just been heavily invested in by Blockbuster, and they had tons of money and were sort of producing all sorts of new games like, sort of the Disney games like Aladdin. And so I went on assignment to visit this studio, which was all kitted out with the latest technology and development stuff and SGI machines and things like that. And it was a pretty amazing experience, sort of getting to sort of interview all the principal technologists at Virgin and talk to them about what games they were producing and where they thought games were going. And it was just very exciting. While I was looking at their games, I would always give feedback on games that we were looking at sort of preview-wise. This looks good. I like that. I'm not sure about this. And, as I was doing that, one of the guys at Virgin said, this is really interesting and quite valuable feedback for us. Would you like to do this for us full time? And, I didn't really think at that time that, sort of jobs like that sort of existed. It was almost like early testing of video game software as a sort of a resident tester. I said, yeah, but would definitely be interested in doing that, particularly if it meant moving out to California, sort of, I loved America. I used to visit quite regularly to go to CES shows and things like that. And so I was sort of, I basically said, yeah, let's talk some more. And we went back and forth, and I was there for a few days. And at the end of that few day period, Virgin made me a sort of a formal job offer and said, yeah, we'd definitely like you to come out to the States and do this job of sort of being our full-time tester. And so, I went back to the UK, thought about it, and just thought, well, this is a really interesting opportunity. And at that time, I was just getting a little bit bored of not necessarily computer games magazines, but we were sort of stuck in a bit of a rut at EMAP with, I wanted to launch a new magazine and I wasn't allowed to do so. I wanted to launch a magazine which would have been very similar to Edge magazine, right. But the publisher didn't want to launch another magazine at that point. So I kind of, I wanted something new to get my teeth into, and this opportunity just felt like the right move. So I moved out to the States in early 1994.
What was it like moving from commentating on the industry, being a journalist, to actually working in the industry? How did you find that transition?
It was pretty tough. Moving to the States, nobody knew who I was at that point, so didn't know my background very well. So I didn't quite have that same sort of critical credibility. So sort of, when I used to criticize the games that were in development, initially I had quite a lot of hostility from the producers of the games and the programmers of the games, sort of, who is this guy and why is he criticizing our beloved game that we're making? But after a while, I began to sort of establish myself, and it was just a very different kind of job being sort of within development and I still spent a tremendous amount of time playing other people's games to make sure that Virgin's games were competitive. So I was still playing a tremendous amount of games, pretty much everything that was being released at the time I was looking at. So that aspect of sort of my lifestyle didn't change much. I was still the sort of the main point person for all things gaming. But it was definitely weird not having that voice, that monthly voice in magazines. I definitely missed that a lot. That's kind of why I went back into video gaming after I'd been at Virgin for about 3.5 years. I got back into video games journalism at IGN in the very, very, very early days of IGN, when it was a bunch of disparate websites. And basically I applied for a job as editorial director, and the objective was to take all of these disparate sites that formed the Imagine Games network and consolidate them into one network and one voice, and essentially establish what would eventually become IGN.com.
Before we get into IGN, I was just going to ask you about an amazing title at Virgin, which was Thrill Kill. And I remember that was kind of scrapped and then leaked online. You worked on that, right? What happened?
Yeah, that was it was originally my idea. At that particular period of time, the ESRB ratings had just come out and had been established. And I remember the president of Virgin Interactive, Martin Alper, I was talking to him one lunchtime about the rating system. And I said, now that games have got proper ratings, why don't we make an adult rated game that's like a fighting game that's sort of sexualized and kind of a little bit grubby and sort of fun and
Risque.
naughty and very risque. And Martin said, yeah, sure. Now we've got ratings, we can build it as knowing, what it's going to be and market it in that way. And so we sat down and came up with a sort of a 4-player fighting game with characters that sort of were very sexualized and sort of and odd, I'm trying to remember, actually. It's a long time ago, but it was basically a game sort of set in hell. The combatants would have to fight one another, and each combatant was a larger than life version of what they'd been in real life, and they were all sort of scumbags in real life. So, we had all these.
There was a dominatrix, a doctor, a gimp on stilts, and this kind of really huge monster guy. Yeah.
The characters were all very odd, and basically we put it into development, and it was actually quite a fun game to play. The stuff that leaked online is very, very early, and I have a feeling that if we'd really managed to keep development going, unfortunately Virgin pretty much shut down before the game was complete, and EA bought all the rights to Virgin's games and decided to scrap Thrill Kill because it was just too risque for them. And it was a pretty disgusting game, but it was designed to be that way, and it would have been very controversial, I'm sure. It's an interesting what if it had actually been released. I think we'd have got a lot of stick for it, but I think a lot of people would have enjoyed playing it because, like I said, what was there was pretty fun to play, and it had some quite innovative lock-on mechanics and different combo moves and things. It was very much sort of inspired by sort of Street Fighter and other fighting games of the period, but it was 3D.
Well, he did move back to journalism in 1997 when he went to work for Imagine Games Network, IGN. And that was a really interesting time. So, we're talking 97. That's very early in the web's commercial life. I think I got online maybe the year before at school, but it really wasn't like, everyone didn't have it in the house then. And you grew that online network. Was it hard to convince people that this was going to be the future and that online was a space that you should be investing time and effort into?
I was really into online at the time. I was, I'd been online since the early CompuNet days with the Commodore 64. We used to log on to bulletin boards and things like that, and CNET, which were very early online services. So I just felt that it was had enormous potential. So when I got invited to join Imagine and work online, it just seemed like an incredible opportunity. And unfortunately, not everybody shared that view at Imagine. Obviously, all the people that were working online believed in it, but most of the people were sort of the very, very junior guys that were working on magazines that kind of got the sort of web thrown at them as, right, can you take care of this? Because, most of the more seasoned journalists weren't really interested in it. They didn't necessarily see the potential in it and just felt that it was a bit remedial. And so we had this small team. It was probably about six months to a year of sort of working on IGN when it was essentially made up of a bunch of different websites that were dedicated to the magazines. And we decided to rebrand the whole thing. And rather than write these sort of websites that really echoed what the magazine was doing, the magazine would publish a bunch of stuff and we'd publish that stuff online after the magazine came out. That just didn't make sense to me. It's like, look, we can publish stuff every day. Let's start doing news and reviews and publishing it as soon as it's ready. Once we started doing that, you could begin to see the penny drop, Imagine. And, the bosses were very forward thinking and were supporting of it, but you could see other people around the company were beginning to sort of get the power of the internet, the fact that somebody would bring in a game to preview one day. We would write the preview, that afternoon and be able to publish it in the evening. whereas a magazine would take, it would take another month for them to write it out and publish it. So we finally began to see that sort of shift in terms of people were like, oh, wait, this internet thing isn't just a load of old crap, and it's actually it's a useful and timely tool. And at that point, it was probably 98, 99, and people were increasingly coming online and finding IGN. I mean, it was, I think at one point it was the 27th biggest website in the world. There were a lot of gamers got online early and would flock to the early websites like GameSpot and IGN, and it just drove enormous amounts of traffic, and that really put us on a path where IGN was eventually spun off from Imagine Games, which was Future Publishing at that point, was spun off into its own company, and we had a bunch of venture capitalists came in to transform the company into a major online presence, which that particular project I spent quite a lot of time on, and mostly fighting against the venture capitalists who wanted to change IGN into a different kind of site, and I sort of didn't agree with what they wanted to do. Fortunately, we managed to keep IGN intact, and it's still going today.
Well, I mean, you took a break from games journalism after that. You went into marketing and online retailing, but then I know you came back and you've done stuff like work for Future US and GamePro Media and US Gamer, doing their website, the Game Network, where you're editor until 2017. I mean, what's kind of your involvement now? I mean, are you still involved in gaming at the moment then, or what?
Yeah, I'm still involved in gaming. I am now a qualitative analyst for a market research company. We research video games. So what I do is I spend a lot of time watching people play video games that are in development and creating reports that analyze player response to things like interfaces, gameplay, or whole entire games. It depends on the particular project. So I create these reports that then, go back to the client whose game it is, and they use those to hopefully make their games better.
Well, Jazz, it's amazing that you've still got the passion for gaming after all these years, and we really appreciate you taking a bit of time out to share those memories with us, especially on a very warm California day.
No problem, it was fun. I really appreciate you inviting me onto the show, and I look forward to hearing it.